It is my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar today, Ensuring Aligned and Effective Instructional Materials for the Common Core is the title. Before we start, I think I'd like to thank everybody who's been a part of this, and I know that you're going to enjoy the webinar moving forward. My name is Anna Tilton, and I'm the Executive Director for Grantmakers for Education. As you can see in this next slide, we've been in existence since 1995. Grantmakers is a membership organization. We actually have approximately 300 organizations that are part of our particular network, and we have 1,500 grant makers who are part of that. What's so exciting is today we have probably, I think there are 46 organizations represented, and we have over 60 people joining as far as this particular session. I'd like to talk about some other sessions that we've had moving forward. Grantmakers for Organization has been focused on Common Core, working directly with many different organizations as well as the DOE. And what you see here are examples of some of the things that we've done. I won't go ahead and read that. One of the things that we are excited about is the webinar moving forward. And the one that we're doing now, we are doing in collaboration with the Common Core Funders Working Group and the Education Funders Strategy Group. Today is actually a second in a series of webinars that we are offering on Common Core. Common Core webinar series will culminate in an in-person member briefing that we'd like to invite you to attend. That member briefing is in Kenton County, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, so you've got a heads up, and we'll be sending more information moving forward. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Melissa Chabron with Education First to kick us off. Melissa?
Great. Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for participating in this webinar. For this webinar, we are hoping that funders will get three things out of this program. The first is to understand more deeply why instructional materials and high-quality instructional materials are important to implement the Common Core. Why is it something that we should focus on? The second is to really gain an awareness of different national research and state efforts in the field to evaluate, identify, and select materials that are happening now that are really exciting. And then the third, and perhaps most important, is really understand how we got to this moment in time. What's really driving this issue, and where are some of the strategic opportunities for funders and for partners that everyone works with? So to kick us off, we're going to have Dennis Udall talk a little bit about the Common Core Funders Working Group. Dennis is a program officer from the William and Hewlett Flora Foundation, and he is going to be talking a little bit about the Common Core Funders Working Group, who is co-hosting this webinar today. Dennis is also going to help set the stage for our topic today and talk a little bit about instructional materials. Then we're going to hear from our presenters, Bill Schmidt and Amy Zalot, and Dennis will talk a little bit about them. But Amy and Bill are both going to talk about what do we know about efforts to identify high-quality instructional materials. After we hear from our presenters, Rachel Norman, who is a program officer from the Leona M. and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust, is going to lead us through a facilitated question and answer session with both the panelists and the Common Core Funders Working Group issue team, which Rachel and Dennis both lead. And just to remind everyone, the lower right-hand corner of your screen is where you will type in your questions. So you'll see a chat box there. So please, throughout any point in the program, feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, and we'll keep a running log for both our presenters as well as our funders who are co-hosting it. Following our Q&A session, Rachel will also update us on other efforts in the field related to high-quality instructional materials and close us out with some thoughts on what are funders' role in supporting high-quality instructional materials. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dennis from the Hewlett Foundation.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everybody. So I'm going to introduce the Common Core Funders Working Group, which, as Anna said, is co-hosting this webinar with GFE. Common Core Funders Working Group is a collection of funders that was started in the fall of 2012. We meet quarterly, mostly in Washington, D.C., and there's a bi-monthly newsletter that folks can sign up for. The co-conveners of the Common Core Funders Working Group are the Educator Funder Strategy Group, GFE itself, and the Growth Philanthropy Network. Among other things, we have two working groups, one of which you'll hear from today. One is on the scaling effective professional development with respect to the Common Core, and the other is ensuring high-quality tools and instructional materials. And you can see the goals of the Common Core Funders Working Group there. So by way of introduction to the webinar itself, I'll just say a little bit here. So we all know the importance of the Common Core, this Common Core moment, if you will. 44 states are adopting the Common Core standards that I think collectively all of us hope will raise student achievement and create arguably a new era of improved teaching and learning on a scale that was largely unthinkable even a few years ago. But we know that there are several big challenges with implementing the core. And the one that we're going to be talking about today is the need for strong instructional materials. So just to back up a bit, we know from several studies that the standards in general by themselves can have a significant influence on student learning. But we also know that if we want to get the biggest bang for the buck, then we need to pay equal attention to all the different inputs that build on effective standards, things like professional development, and teacher evaluation, and instructional materials, etc. With the adoption of the Common Core and the Common Core assessments that are due out later this year and next year, there's been a whole lot of attention to testing and standards and accountability. And thankfully, we're starting to see a pretty widespread effort to increase teacher capacity to teach these new standards. But oddly enough, there's been relatively little focus on one of these key inputs, and that's instructional materials and how teachers and students kind of interact with these materials. The irony here is that it's hard, to overestimate the impact that instructional materials can have on students' learning. First, we know that teachers rely heavily on instructional materials. For example, and this is from a Brookings Institute report, 50% of fourth graders do math problems every day from a textbook. And about 70 to 98% of teachers use textbook at least weekly. Second, there's also pretty strong evidence that the choice of instructional materials has a huge impact on student learning that's as large or even larger than the impact of teacher quality in some instances. But improving teacher effectiveness is a pretty time-consuming and expensive undertaking, whereas making better choices about instructional materials is less labor-intensive and expensive. So one thing we're not going to deal with today much at all is the effectiveness of instructional materials in increasing student performance and student outcomes, which is a hugely complicated issue, probably deserving its own webinar. Instead, we're going to be focusing on the alignment of instructional materials with the Common Core. So in this way, districts and states and educators have been increasingly calling for more and better aligned materials. It's become pretty clear that we need first, an objective way for states and districts to make smart choices about the materials that they're actually, the materials that are actually aligned to the Common Core, as opposed to publishers and others that just pay lip service to alignment. Two, we need clear criteria that will help teachers develop and share curriculum and lessons that are aligned to the Common Core. And Finally, we need specific criteria that tells the publishing industry itself what Common Core materials actually look and feel like. So without all this, there's a very real fear out there that we won't be able to deliver on the promise of the Common Core as a more rigorous and stronger set of content standards. So now let's turn to Bill and Amy, who are going to help us understand why it's time. The time has come really to pay attention to the fact that instructional materials are likely to play a huge role in the effective rollout of the Common Core, and particularly as they influence classroom instruction. So I introduced Bill and Amy. Bill Smith, as many of you know, is a professor at Michigan State University. He's a distinguished professor and co-director of education policy, where he holds faculty appointments in measurement and quantitative methods. His writings and research are on issues of academic content in K-12 schooling and teacher preparation, and the effects of curriculum on academic achievement. And I think most people will know Bill Schmidt through his outstanding work on the TIMSS study, or the Third International Mathematics and Science Study of some years ago. Amy Delott is a teacher at Lafayette High School. She's been teaching English Language Arts for 17 years and received National Board Certification in 2012. She is also co-authored the 12th grade English Language Arts curriculum found in the Louisiana Teacher Support Toolbox on louisianabelieves.com, and I think Amy's going to be talking a little bit more about that. Amy currently, as I mentioned, works at Lafayette High School in Lafayette, Louisiana, and is an instructional strategist. And in that capacity, she provides a lot of support for to other teachers in all the content areas in grades 9 and 12. So I'll pass it off to Bill. Thank you, everyone.
I'm sorry, I realized I had my mute on, and I was talking and realized I was muted, so I'll start over. I would like to broaden this slightly and talk about the whole implementation process, because I think the issues of the instructional materials are so definitely intertwined with the teachers themselves that I'd like to sort of show the relationship between those and to talk about why implementation really requires a change, and the kind of change that we're talking about in this session of how we bring about for better instructional materials and what impact that might have. I think without any question, instructional materials are absolutely essential. You know, way back years ago, there was a line of research that identified, and it's not really that earth-shatteringly different from what you would expect. There are three elements. When you study schooling, you really need to confront those three issues. One is the teacher, the student, and the content, which also refers then to the instructional materials. And so the first slide I'd like to show you is one that shows a real issue that emerges, which has to do with how the teachers spend their instructional time. Now, this may seem not necessarily that important, but one of the most important resources in a school is how the teacher allocates his or her time to the topics that need to be covered according to the standards. And that is both across the years and within the year. And so what you have here in this slide is a display that shows you there are 8 columns, one for each of the 8 grades. The colors are, of course, for different content areas. And I'm going to talk about it in a more general way, so you don't have to worry about that in particular. But within each of those 8 columns, the bar to the left within that set is what the teachers themselves have allocated to the covering of those 10 basic areas from the content core in mathematics. Now, this is balanced over the entire year, and this is over 400 or 500 teachers. So this is not about 1 or 2 teachers. This is a representative group of teachers and what they're spending their time on. And of course, over the year, then this adds to 100%. So it's a proportional allocation of their time to varying topics. The bar to the right within each column is what the experts say should be being allocated to the coverage of those content areas in the Common Core. So I draw your attention to the 3rd and 4th and 5th grade, and in particular to the blue area. The blue area is fractions, one of the single most important topics in the whole of the curriculum in those early grades. We know that it's one of the most difficult areas for students. We also know that from a mathematical point of view, it is one of the most fundamental, important aspects of mathematics. You cannot really go on in mathematics to algebra and beyond unless you thoroughly understand fractions and understand them as a part of a number system, the rational number system. So those are really central, and in the Common Core, that is probably the single big topic across grades 3, 4, and 5, especially in grades 4 and 5. So if you look at that display, you'll see that in 3rd grade and 4th grade, the amount of time proportionally over the year that the teachers allocate is about half of what the experts suggest. So what you have is a huge gap starting already in 3rd grade, going further, again about a half in 4th grade, and in 5th grade it comes a little bit closer to the expectation of the experts, but by then you have to figure that these children are already well behind what they would be needed in order for them to deeply understand in a focused, deep way the topic of fractions. So I think this points out that the allocation of time under the new Common Core, since there are no specifications in the standards themselves as to what proportion of time should be spent to these, that teachers are making judgments, decisions about how to allocate that time. And those decisions are overemphasizing certain areas and underemphasizing, like fractions, a very important area, underemphasizing the amount of time that's being spent in those areas. A difference of almost a half, again, half as much as should be, is a substantial amount if you look over the entire year when you're talking somewhere around 20% versus something around 10%. That's a big difference, and it translates into months of instruction or more. So the first point I just want to make is teachers are making decisions about how to cover the new Common Core standards and how much time to spend and allocate to the coverage of those topics. Those instructional decisions are absolutely fundamental and critical. And yet we see from this, at least as is the case now, the teachers are probably not allocating it in the way that those who have a better knowledge of what it would take to really implement the Common Core correctly, that they're really not responding in the ways that they should be doing so. Well, one of the things to think about when you talk about the need for textbooks is that it depends on what the knowledge base of the teacher is that the teacher is bringing to the instructional materials that they have. And so this just shows you from some research we've done. This slide represents 4th and 5th grade teachers, and they're self-reporting how well prepared academically they are to teach these varying topics you see, these 4 listed here. And you'll see with common fractions, you have 75% of the teachers saying they feel well prepared. Well, you would first of all like that to be 100%, because otherwise about 25% of the teachers are essentially a large percentage, and correspondingly the kids then are being taught by the teachers who don't feel well enough prepared to teach that. But you know, in order to really do common fractions and do it well, you need to look at that number sets and concepts. It is a number. It is part of the rational number system, as I said a moment ago, and only less than 40% of the teachers really feel academically prepared in that area. So you have the case where a larger percent feel they're well enough prepared to teach fractions, but they don't have the background really to do it and do it well. This only makes the instructional materials even more important, because if they themselves are not lined up well or do not cover well these topics, in the hands of teachers who already are feeling less than perfectly well prepared to teach these topics, you have a real potential for a difficulty. If you look at middle school, it's even worse, because the new Common Core standards call for heavy coverage in the middle grades, starting in 6th, but especially in 7th and 8th, focusing on algebra. And here you have about half the teachers saying they're feeling well prepared to teach linear equations. Linear equations lies at the heart, as fractions is the most important in many ways topic in those early grades around 4th and 5th grade. Certainly understanding a linear equation is the corresponding part that assumes that same level of importance for grades 7 and 8. And here you see again that there's a lack of self-assuredness on the part of these teachers, which I respect. They are simply telling us they have not been prepared academically in their training to be able to teach these topics that we're referring to. And just to make you aware of the fact that this is not a problem just with those teachers who have been teaching for 20, 30 years, this is a current problem as well. The next two slides just show you how difficult and how much difficulty we're going to have in really moving over and implementing the Common Core in the way we would all like to see it being done. We did an international study in which we looked at the preparation of teachers. What I'm showing you here is for middle school mathematics. So these are mathematics teachers that are being prepared to teach in what the rest of the world calls lower secondary, which we refer to as middle school, 6, 7, 8, 9, somewhere in that vicinity. And what we did is we looked at all across 18 countries. We identified the programs within any of those countries which were simply outstanding in their preparation. We judged the outstanding by the fact that we tested these students while they were still in college, these future teachers. In their last month of preparation, we gave them a test of the mathematics that they would need as deemed by experts in order to teach a middle school curriculum. And they also were given a test on the pedagogy, the concepts and ideas involved in what it took to properly teach the mathematics. And now that we have the Common Core, which are internationally benchmarked standards, which means we are expecting our teachers now to teach what we have learned over time is what's taught in most of those top achieving countries, this becomes very important. So with those top programs, we identified 9 university-level courses, 6 in mathematics, 2 in the teaching of mathematics, and a third one having to do with a course directly about school-level mathematics that's involved at the middle school level. And so with those 9 courses, we then could ask the question, what % of all the future teachers that are coming out have had that kind of coursework in order to be able to use good instructional materials and to recognize good instructional materials and be able to use them appropriately? And we found that across the 83 public-private universities that we sampled in the study, a totally representative sample of the whole of the U.S. teacher preparation programs, we found that only about a third of them actually had that kind of coursework required of them during their teacher preparation. Only a third. By contrast, in Russia and Taiwan, virtually all of their future teachers have had that kind of teacher preparation. Well, the problem becomes even more acute when you look at this next slide, which shows that if you take our U.S. programs and divide them into the top 25% in terms of that test that I referred to a moment ago, that international test, and then the bottom 25%, again, this is a random sample of U.S. institutions. In the top 25%, about 80% take those 9 courses. They're being fairly well prepared by international standards. But if you look at the bottom quartile, the bottom 25%, only about 10% of those future teachers are having to take coursework that's commensurate with what you find in the top achieving programs worldwide. So you can see what we've got here is a real problem of diversity in the United States in terms of teacher preparation. There are some in the top that are prepared among the best of the world from the world's point of view. In fact, there are a few of our programs that were part of that core of 39 defining the excellent programs. but the bottom quartile is more commensurate in its performance with countries such as Botswana, developing countries, not what you would expect in the United States. And here's the bottom line, which comes back to the textbooks and their use and recognizing what time to allocate to topics, those very central issues. That bottom quartile, because of the size of those schools that are in that bottom quartile, they produce 60% of all future middle school teachers in the United States. And this was a study just done 4 or 5 years ago. So these are still what are being produced out of our institutions in terms of these teachers and their respective knowledge of mathematics. Now you mix that with the fact that the instructional materials, as has been alluded, are not really lining up very well, and I'm going to come to that next, that we really have a problem in terms of implementation that is really rather serious, because if the textbooks are weak and not aligned and the teachers themselves don't have the background to really know and recognize that, then you end up with what that first slide showed, which is disproportionate amounts of time being allocated to the wrong topics and underrepresented in certain topics which are absolutely critical. Well, that brings us to the instructional materials. Let me explain, before I show you briefly those results, that we have analyzed over 700 textbooks in the United States. We've analyzed some 40 series of textbook series. Of all of those that we've estimated are in use right now by somewhere around 60–70% of all students in this country. In other words, we took the most commonly used books and analyzed those because that's what the teachers right now are confronted with. We've also analyzed some of the new books which are just coming out, which have no history really or a strong following yet because they're brand new, and I will refer to those in a couple of moments. But the reality is that with the economic downturn still somewhat in place and states still struggling to some extent, there's not going to be a lot of money, it appears, to automatically buy new series. And so what's out there is what teachers have to work with. So let me show you those results. I warn you that they are not pretty and really suggest, as was just described, a very serious problem. So here is one textbook series for the Common Core that is very widely used. This is one of the most commonly used books in series in the whole of the United States. This is an elementary book, so it goes from kindergarten through grade 5. So there are 6 grades. And let me explain these numbers so you have a sense of this. If you go to each one of those grades and look at the Common Core state standards and ask how many standards are at each of those grades, how many in kindergarten, first, second, etc., and add those together, you come up with the number 231 that you see in this graph. That's the number of standards that should be taught at each of the grade levels across the 6 grades, kindergarten to 5th grade. Now, if you look right below that 231, those are the number of standards in this textbook series that are covered at each grade level that should be being covered at that grade level. So in other words, you just take to 3rd grade or any other grade and look in the book for that series at that grade level and count how many of the standards appropriate to 3rd grade are in that book, and then add them up over all those 6 grades. And you come up with 166. That number then represents that they're covering 72% of the standards that should be covered are being covered by that series at the appropriate grade level. That means there's about 28%, not about, it is 28%, or about 30% of the standards that should be being covered according to the Common Core are not found in the textbooks in this series at those appropriate grades. So you have a lot of standards missing and being covered. That's the first metric that I suggest to you that tells us that we're in trouble with the instructional materials that are out there right now in terms of helping teachers implement the core. The second one is to go back up to the numbers up above where it says the number of standards covered. You saw the 166. there are 132 and 271 standards in those books that are being covered that have nothing to do with the grade level in which they're found. In other words, these are, if you go again to that third grade text and you count how many are there that belong there, we also counted how many there that should have been done at an earlier grade and how many there that should be being done at a later grade. And the sum of those are those two numbers that come up with 569. What that 569 means, that means if you take the Common Core standards over those 6 grades, there are 569 of them covered in this K-5 series, which then leads you to the fact that there's the last number on that table, the 29%. That's the percent of all the standards that are covered that are on grade, 29%. Let me translate that into something that's just much more understandable. That means only about a third of the books in that series really cover what they should be being covered. Or another way to say it is almost 2/3 of the book is completely irrelevant. So the further translation is if you take a teacher with the backgrounds we've just described in the previous couple of slides and give them this textbook series for the grades K-5, and the teachers in each of those grades follow those books from page 1 to however far they get, they essentially, that only about a third of all of that time will keep those kids on track as to what they should be learning in the order that the Common Core calls for them to be covered. And remember, from all that Tim's research that you referred that I was involved in, we learned that coherence is the key characteristic that distinguishes good programs from good sets of standards from others, and that means that it's not arbitrary. It is important in what order. That's how children learn when it is in the correct hierarchical order that represents the discipline. So this is a second index and a serious indictment. It basically says most of these books are off target and off grade level and therefore not helpful for implementing the Common Core. The next slide might just make it a little bit more explicit what I'm talking about. It's that same series. Here's grades 2 and 5. Look at grade 5. 40 standards in the Common Core should be covered in that book. Only 25 of them are, meaning that you've got, a large number of standards that aren't even covered, 15 of them. Then if you look further, you'll see that the standards that are covered, there are some from 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 6th, 7th, and 8th grade that don't belong there that are in that book. There are more of those, 52 and 30, or 80 standards that are covered in that 5th grade book that aren't 5th grade topics according to the Common Core. So it's a chaotic mix is what it basically amounts to. We're subjecting our kids to books that don't teach them everything they do need to know and that teach them a lot of things that are out of sync, which means it's just that much more confusing for the students. But the simplest of conclusions is they simply don't line up with the Common Core. These books are essentially a diversion, a distraction from what should be being covered. And since we know that teachers often cover and follow their books page by page, the results of this are quite disastrous from the point of the Common Core. And I can represent this chaos by this little slide here, which the gray shaded area are the topics, math topics, that should be covered at each of the 8 columns representing the 8th grade. Excuse me, this is the K-5 series again. So the grades 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this one has 6. So it's 6. No, excuse me. Grade 1 is a kindergarten. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what you have here is what should be being covered in the gray area, and all the circles that aren't in the gray area are things that are being done off grade level and inappropriately at a different. And this slide just sort of represents the same thing you just saw, but it sort of is a nice depiction of the chaos and how the lack of focus comes about when you try to teach a bunch of things that should be being covered. And that's why one of my recommendations to districts when they ask me, well, what book should we buy? my first response is I wouldn't buy anything at this point in time. I'd give it another year or so because there are new materials beginning to come out, and some of those do have promise. We've seen a few of them recently that actually do line up. If you saw the picture comparable to this one, all those circles outside of the gray area pretty much disappear. And a couple of the newer books that we've just that are just being published and we've just recently been able to analyze. So that's my first response. And my second one is, until you see books that come out more consistent in size with the international books, at 8th grade about 300 pages, 350, and at 4th grade about 150, 200 pages, instead of the ones that we do have, which are about 800 pages at 8th grade and about 500 at 4th grade, until you see those books shrink down in size, you're just being fed a fake story about whether these things really deal with the Common Core. And it just brings me full circle to the first slide that I showed you, where I showed the inconsistency. This is the same slide, only each column I've added a third sort of line to a third set to the two that before within each column, and that third one is what the textbook dictates. Textbooks tell you how much time to spend on various things that come across for the whole year. Go back to grades 3 and 4, for example, and 5 for that matter, and look at the blue for the teachers, what they did, and the blue for the textbook. They're almost identical. So in other words, that earlier slide we saw on the misappropriation of the time, instructional time, is a reflection of the books themselves, most likely. I mean, I can't prove that, but it's a really incredible coincidence to see those blue lines for the first and the third within the set of a given grade level is pretty much the same. And those both then are inconsistent with what others, those who have thought more carefully about what should be being covered and how much time should be given to it at each grade level, they're much less than that, although in some other areas they're more. So it really represents that misrepresentation of what would take to really implement these Common Core standards. So we have a problem. We have books that aren't going to be very supportive of the Common Core, what's out there now, and we have teachers, as you saw by their own self-report, not particularly feeling that well academically prepared, and you put those two things together and you have a real problem. And this is what I think we have to know how to contend with in order to move forward and successfully implement the Common Core. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for all of that content. Really want to get into it, and just wanted to remind folks on the call to type your questions into the chat box in the lower part of your screen. We are going to have time to get into it. But before we do that, we're going to hear from Amy Zalot from Lafayette High School, who is a teacher and also an instructional strategist at Lafayette High School. Amy?
Thank you, Melissa. In 2011, when I first started fully implementing the Common Core standards in my classroom, I was faced with a huge dilemma. Not only was I going to be using text that was at an increased complexity level than I had used before, but I was also going to be incorporating nearly twice as much informational sources as I had previously used. And our current state-approved textbooks, they didn't meet the requirements of the standards, and I spent countless hours searching on the Internet, browsing the public library to supplement the curriculum. Our state superintendent, John White, saw this and also released, I think, some of your reading for this, referenced his article. He recognized this deficiency in the instructional materials, and he made a formal announcement that the state would not be approving any publishing companies, but instead letting districts decide for themselves what curricula would be needed for their specific districts to meet their needs. So as a teacher, this was a very scary situation to be in. Districts were new to the standards. They'd never evaluated curriculum for alignment to standards. We'd always relied on the state to tell us which books were good, and we decided how much money we had to spend. As teachers, we were definitely worried. We wanted to implement the standards with fidelity, but without aligned instructional materials, it seemed like it was going to be a daunting task for us. So one of the things that we did in Louisiana is our Department of Education felt strongly that it was the teachers who were the content experts and who were in the classroom, and they knew best how the students were responding to the standards within instruction. And we we believe that the teachers can be the SEA's greatest resource in identifying those materials. That being said, state departments are also going to have to vet the teachers that they select to do this work with them. Our process in Louisiana involved teachers completing a performance task, and we identified over 100 teachers across the past 2 years to do a performance task, and then helped us to create curriculum exemplars, sample assessment pieces, and also review current instructional materials from publishing companies to verify that they were truly aligned to the standards. So this is a very different process from previous textbook material reviews. Teachers now aren't looking for the bells and whistles of the past. We're not worried about how many online materials are provided or does it come with a free scanner. Instead, we want curriculum that is truly aligned to the standards. We know that implementing Common Core is going to be hard work for us as teachers, so we want a curriculum that's going to bring those appropriate texts and questions in order to make our work more efficient. So time getting to know the rubric was important. Our teacher advisors went through training and practice activities with both the IMET by Student Achievement Partners and the Equip rubric by Achieve. And we also found that face-to-face meetings were important for us to really learn how those rubrics worked with the instructional materials that we were reviewing. So throughout the review process, we engaged in constant communication. We found that our teams benefited from conference calls and group emails to make sure that we were locating the criteria within the platform, since every publishing company has its own publishing platform that it uses. We also went through a process of having math and ELA groups kind of co-review each other's work to help us make sure our reviews weren't filled with teacher speak that wouldn't be familiar to publishers or to some of the rubric audiences, which was district personnel. And then we also had a district liaison, an SEA liaison who worked with us to make sure that we had consistent alignment of materials with the rubric across major grade clusters. So one of the first important things for us to do, we started with the Equip rubric, and we found that it was ideal for lesson and unit lesson plans, but it wasn't ideal for evaluating a year-long curriculum that a publishing company would put together. The design of the IMET was better aligned to the purpose for what we were doing. However, we felt there were still some areas that we needed to revise. The IMET is probably the ideal rubric for curriculum, and we would want all curriculum to achieve this goal. However, we know that during this transition time, it's probably not going to be realistic. So Louisiana's approach in this revision was to provide tiers so that districts and teachers could make purchasing choices knowing exactly where they were going to have to supplement at the classroom and district level in order to achieve alignment to the standards. So most of the Louisiana districts now are using these rubrics the reviews that we've completed to help them know which materials are the closest aligned to the standards. So I'm just going to review some of the findings that we saw across multiple reviews. Many of the publishers provided text complexity scores, but for teachers the rationale was not always clear. So a teacher who is new to using text complexity would need to know why was text A the best choice for this unit and this standard. We also found that in some of the upper grades in literacy, they were very less flexible in their text selections. So in English 3 and 4 or 11th and 12th grade, we've always taught linear literature, and we often include text just because they're the expected representation of that time period, instead of looking at how the text actually does meet the standards. So as teachers, we know it's our responsibility to design instruction so that close reading can be embedded in the lesson. But what we found is that few of the publishers were providing clear guidance for the teachers. For example, which passage in this longer text is worthy of a reread? Why? What text-dependent questions are going to help my students dig deeper into this complex portion of the test? And we also found that students needed more activities to do that self-discovery of the background information instead of always doing this front-loading piece that teachers normally just turn into their introductory lecture for a time period. Some other findings is that many of the questions only stayed at the surface level, didn't really force the students to dig deep. There might have been one question at the end of each unit that was a dig deep question. And also there was a lot of missing pieces in the assessment. Students needed to see more questions that guided them through a cold read piece so that they would have the scaffolding and support they needed in order to move to those deep analytical questions. And students needed to see questions that really had them analyze author's word choice, including academic vocabulary. So we do have publishers who are providing academic vocabulary within the text, but they're not doing it in a meaningful way so that students are really analyzing why is this word choice important in this piece of text. Another finding is that a lot of the publishers are maybe revising the teacher and student editions of the textbook and not always revising the ancillary materials. So we know that a lot of teachers turn to those ancillary guidebooks for the units when they're creating their unit assessments, and if those questions haven't been changed and they're not text dependent, then you're never going to find true alignment in the Common Core classroom. So some of the things that we found is that many of the high school texts, middle and high school in ELA, were coming in at Tier 2. So it shows us that publishers are working towards alignment. As I said, usually it was the teacher and student edition of the text that was more closely aligned. But with the ancillary pieces, one of the scary things is we actually found questions in one ancillary unit guide that had been written 10 years prior to the adoption of the Common Core standards, yet it still had the Common Core aligned red rubber stamp applied to the front of it. So one of the final concerns that I had here was that the self-paced credit recovery programs that claimed CCS alignment, it's just not there yet. Most of these programs are relying on internet copies of text. They don't provide the students with the support and questioning that they need to help the students engage with the text. Usually they're intended for like one-to-one instruction on the computer. So they front load all of the materials with video lecture for the students instead of letting the students engage with the text and discover what the text says. So what we've done as teacher leaders with the support of our state SDA is to provide districts and teachers with honest reviews of the material that's being marketed in our state. If a publishing company is going to come to our district and sell its products, we want the district to know this is what it really looks like. All of these reviews have been posted on Louisiana Believes, and anyone can view them to see the rating that we've assigned it, as well as the comments about each of the criteria and the evidence that we found supporting our rating. Many of the districts in our state are using this information to help them make purchasing decisions. In most cases, districts are relying on Tier 1 or Tier 2. So they know if I purchase a Tier 2 textbook, these are specific criteria that this textbook did not do well on the rubric, so I'm going to have to supplement at the district or class level. So we know this has been a very time-consuming project for all of the teacher advisors who are involved, but we can't help to think of the thousands of teachers across the state and even the nation who are going to benefit from the comments in the reviews. Just knowing what a curriculum's weak links are will go a long way to helping teachers make the best instructional decisions for their classroom.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you so much, Bill. This is Rachel Norman from the Helmsley Trust. I encourage all of our participants to get busy entering your questions into the chat window. I know that Bill needs to leave us soon to catch a plane, so I want to make sure that if you have questions for Bill, you get those in very soon. I know, Bill, probably most of us, when we first see your presentations, are running up to you at the end saying, okay, so which books were good and which weren't? Can you talk just a little bit about your decision about whether or not to name names and how that kind of impacts the advice that you're able to give folks when I'm sure they come calling?
Yes, that's a good question. I've really struggled with that because I set out to do this as a researcher to understand the nature of the problem around instructional materials, and I didn't want to get into being the new version of Consumer Reports for the textbooks that are out there. And so I've struggled with that quite a bit. And you may be surprised actually by this, Rachel, because I've been thinking more and more about it, and I think that my worry about it is destroying my neutrality, my academic integrity of not getting into endorsing books. But I think I've come to struggle and figure I think I may be coming up with an idea that will allow me to put out something that would be useful to the field, because the field so much needs this to know with the materials they have, the nature of the dilemma that they're confronted with as to how far it is. I think maybe by the fall that I'll probably have something that I can get out there that I can feel comfortable with. But I just want you to know it's not that I recognize the need, but I struggle with remaining the kind of place where you can have information that's not tainted by anything. It's just it has its integrity, and that's what I want to preserve, because that's been very important with the work that I've been doing.
Thanks, Bill. You spoke quite a bit about elementary and middle school textbooks today. Have you done any upper secondary reviews? And if so, are there particular grade bands where you find the most need?
Well, yeah, we have looked at some of those. When you get up to the more advanced, like the AP calculus, and of course those things have been well thought through, and they're fine. Where you find it is, unfortunately, again, is at the beginning in the basic 9th and 10th grade when you got algebra and geometry books. We have looked at some of those, not nearly as much as we have the K to 8, but yes, we have, and they suffer from the same kinds of problems. And I know one of the school districts we're working with that is trying to work to implement this is really struggling with how to deal with that. So unfortunately, it doesn't really get any better as you move into the secondary level.
Got it. Thank you. And do your reviews look at all at the extent to which these textbooks are making accommodations for English language learners and students with disabilities? Has anyone looked at them if that's not in your purview?
That's not something we've actually looked at, and I know of no one that yet is looking at that kind of an issue. I think I wouldn't be since the books themselves line up so poorly, I think that's the first order to look at. There's another issue that we haven't been able to look at, and that is the actual quality of the mathematics, whether it's done appropriately. Now, the standards are fairly specifically written, and so this is we can get much tighter on that than with previous standards before the Common Core. But still, there's another layer there, too, about the quality of the mathematics and whether it's done correctly. And those are even huge. Those are huge tasks. They're much larger in scope and demand to do that. And so we've only been able to take it to the first level, but the judgment on our part was that, look, if it's not even aligned in any reasonable fashion with what should be being done, and when you see statistics that show that, on average only about across all the books we've done, around 30-40% of the books are even relevant to the Common Core at a given grade level, and there are big holes in what's not being covered at each grade level, it doesn't seem worthwhile to go the next step since these provide such gaping holes to begin with.
Thanks, Bill. Again, to our participants, there's a user interface if you'd like to enter questions. We look forward to fielding them. We did have one. Bill, why do you think that the publishers haven't stepped up in a more forceful way to align their materials to the Common Core state standards at this point?
Well, I can tell you that a friend of mine, a mathematician, went and talked to some of the publishers, and at that point, now that was a couple years ago, their response was, this too will go away. They sort of felt that this might be another fad of education in this country. Now I think the reality is sinking in, and now they are beginning to respond more earnestly to this. But I think for a long time they weren't really sure whether this thing was going to have any staying power. So some of the more recent things we actually, as I said, are looking better. And in fact, one of the people doing the coding brought me a book, and the previous 800-page version of the same publisher, 8th grade 800-page book, was now about half its size. I don't have the results on how well it lines up, but that movement alone tells me that they're starting now to respond to what's in these books. But again, that's a long, even as they come out, there's going to be a long time, I would bet, when the books that we've described in great detail, the ones that are out there, are still going to be out there. And so the real question is, what do you do in that particular case? And what I can suggest there is one approach we have taken, but we're only in a beta version of this, is that developed a program based on all this coding so that a teacher can get on there and say, I'm teaching third grade, this is my book, I want to teach this particular standard, and the software will generate all the page numbers in which that topic is covered within that book, so that the teacher can at least know how to use the book, that the curriculum the standards will drive the curriculum, and the textbooks will just be used as they match up. And that then also tells the teacher all the parts of the book that don't need to be covered because they have nothing to do with that year's standards. And so that's one device that with the districts we're working with, we're trying to pilot and see how that works. And it seems to be a very big help to these teachers because the standards drive the curriculum and not the textbooks. And I think that's the first step that has to occur with what we have out there right now in order to get this thing moving in the direction to really implement the Common Core.
Great, thank you. So this is a question for Bill and for Amy. Amy referenced very quickly louisianabelieves.com/academics, where the results of Louisiana's curriculum reviews have been publicly posted, naming names, saying what's good, what's approaching good, and what just isn't there yet at all. So I would encourage everybody to check that out. It's a huge public service, not only for the educators and students in Louisiana, but for everybody that cares about this topic. And many of the resources that Amy's team evaluated are actually available online for free, in addition to traditional commercial textbooks. Bill, Amy, can you say a few words about the role of open educational resources to which educators are increasingly turning as they are learning more and more that they may have to supplement or kind of ignore a lot of what's going on in the textbooks that are in front of them?
I think one of the things that we've learned is that teachers have to be very wary about what they do just pull off the internet. And one of the things that we're doing in our district and in our state conversations is reminding teachers, if you pull something off an internet, especially if you get it from a site like Teachers Pay Teachers and you're not sure who that source is and if it's been vetted, then you need to use a rubric such as the IMET or the EQUIP rubric to really look at the alignment to the standards. And our first goal in Louisiana in looking at curriculum was to look at the open source ones that were available because we knew that's where most of our districts were going to turn first during that transition time.
I couldn't agree more with what Amy said. And I would add just in mathematics, at least in particular, the notion of trying to sort of assemble what might be the equivalent of a textbook from going to sites and picking things of that sort is probably, although it sounds appealing, it's really fraught with the dangers that Amy suggested, which is they may not fit together, and textbooks are hard to write, and so the good ones, and therefore that's why they don't come. We don't have a lot of them out there, but I think going and trying to hodgepodge put together something for supplementing, I think it's fine. But if you're trying to really replace the textbook in math, that's another dangerous road to go, which I think could lead to even greater problems because the coherence is the key feature, and that's hard to put together when you don't have a really strong background in mathematics.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Thanks very much. And Bill, before you turn into a pumpkin, we all want to ask what's on the mind of every funder that cares about this topic and cares about supporting educators in Common Core implementation, whether at the district, state, or national level. What would your suggestions for funders be, whether they are focusing on direct services in a local school district or focused on policy issues regionally or nationally?
Wow. It's a credible opportunity to influence people that have money that want to support this, but it's a really complicated question. I think, let me just divorce the two. If you're going and working with particular districts in that, I would say that I would do anything you could to help free the teachers as much as possible away from following the books, because that's just really the dead end, and bring to them some resources whereby they at least collectively could look at their books and find how they might be used more sensibly by letting the standards drive the organization of the curriculum rather than the books themselves, by perhaps bringing in people that know the mathematics well enough that they could help the teachers in such a task. We've actually done that with some of the districts we're working with, and it turns out it's an incredible, powerful professional development activity, we're told, by the curriculum directors and so forth, is to get the teachers just to sit down and think about, okay, these are the standards, this is third grade, and have them with fourth and second grade teachers, and they begin to look at the redundancies, and they begin to get a sense of how maybe better to use their books. At the national policy level, I think to continue to support, this is of course my bias, research that would inform the policymakers what the issues are, what potential solutions may exist for some of these things, so that we get more tools out there and more ideas that would help as we struggle with this absolutely incredibly important issue of how we properly implement these Common Core standards. Because we did a study just recently that shows, yeah, we're on the right track. There's no real question about that anymore. Yeah, there are grumblings from some small groups here and there, but there really isn't an issue when you come down to the quality of what we've done. But now we need to figure out how to help in a public policy way to get these things effectively in place, and to remove some of the distractions that have arisen that have nothing to do with the Common Core other than their use, and then that's a separate issue. So I think supporting research and people who are thinking about this and putting together ways, and the other area that I think a big one is communication. I've maintained that from the very beginning, that one of the biggest problems is the Common Core let its name be besmirched by people who put things on silly materials and call them Common Core aligned. And so one of the things we need is a real first-class PR effort by those who know how to do PR to really bring the issues to the fore so people have sensible information in front of them, not what they're getting from the fringe groups that are attacking. And there's nothing in the middle trying to really, nothing of a widespread manner helping the people to really see how beneficial this would be for their children. So those would be just a couple of ideas I have.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Amy, would you say a few words about the changes that you've observed in the educators that you support and in the students' apprehension of the learning expectations of the Common Core in the 2 years during which educators didn't have much guidance about what instructional materials they should use, and now when your team and the state of Louisiana is beginning to issue its very detailed recommendations about what's quality and what is approaching quality?
Sure. I think the first couple of years we definitely saw a lot of student apprehension because we were using a lot more runoff copies rather than the textbook, and they were concerned, why aren't we reading out of the textbook? And when we began to explain to the students that they needed to have more experience with complex text to better prepare them for success in college and career, especially my honors students are like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Why not get me ready for college? So the students were, for the most part, very accepting of being challenged, especially when you offered the right supports to them. So, sorry, I am still in the classroom and we have a bell. Teachers now, though, we have a list of instructional materials that we know have been vetted and they are aligned to the standards. So we know that we don't have to spend as much time going and searching for materials and creating aligned tech stacks, because we've identified some of those strongest pieces that are available on the market for us. Additionally, if a teacher is using that curriculum that was identified as a Tier 2, now that teacher has clear access to specific areas that they're going to have to put in additional supports in order to fully align their lesson plans and instruction. One of the greatest benefits for us as a state is that teachers know that these reviews were conducted by other teachers who had an invested interest in identifying aligned materials because it was going to be used in their own classrooms. So it's kind of helped us to increase the power and respect for the teacher voice within our own state.
That's great, Amy. Thank you so much. Well, I'd love to expand just a bit on some of the items that Amy and Bill so beautifully explained and touched upon. Just to let everybody know that it is not all bad news out there. There's lots of great efforts in our field that are in place already to help district and state purchasers make great decisions about what instructional materials they should be recommending to schools. The instructional materials evaluation tool by Student Achievement Partners that Amy mentioned was the sort of heart and soul of Louisiana's review process, is a set of criteria for full-year curriculum. EQUIP is a rubric that was developed by Achieve that evaluates individual lessons and units of study. The task review criteria for illustrative mathematics, from illustrative mathematics, deals with individual mathematics tasks that are aligned to the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics and their appropriate progressions through the grades, as Bill mentioned so forcefully. It's really important that topics are covered coherently, and illustrative mathematics is a really great resource for making sure that educators are able to do that. There's also a great deal of information from the Charles A. Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin about instructional materials reviews, so I would encourage folks to look at those. Now, you know, the process that Amy described is an incredibly complex one, and fortunately there are lots of time-saving efforts to which you can direct individual educators, schools, districts, states. Lots of folks have already done a lot of hard work and heavy lifting to vet instructional materials and make them widely available, often free of charge. So you see before you here sources of vetted instructional materials from individual units to full-year curriculum. Again, I want to call your attention, of course, to louisianabelieves.com/academics, where you can find full-year curriculum reviews named names. Also to engagenewyork.org, which is full-year curriculum that has been downloaded multiple millions of times, both within and outside of the state of New York. We have a colleague that that almost jokingly refers to Engage New York as Engage America because it's being used in so many states and implemented just nationally. I also wanted to let folks know that there are some emerging evaluations and ratings platforms that are going to be open for all users. Graphite is a platform created by Common Sense Media that makes it easier for educators to find digital products like apps, games, websites for the classroom that are mapped to the Common Core State Standards. Coming soon is a new nonprofit organization called edreports.org. Obviously, one of the major barriers, as we've discussed today, to effective implementation of the standards is this insufficient supply of the curriculum that's aligned to the standards. And this new organization is going to aim to provide curriculum purchasers, individual educators, and other key stakeholders with transparent, authoritative, educator-led, consumer report style reviews of major mathematics textbooks and instructional content, including digital courseware. And we're expecting to have its first reviews available in the fall. And overall, of course, this nonprofit's goal is to help support the effective implementation of the Common Core State Standards with respect to curricular decisions. So with that, I wanted to just close with a few ideas about what is our role as funders in supporting Common Core aligned instructional materials. A lot of this might feel sort of difficult to access, but in fact I think that there are a lot of really important things that each of us can do in our practice today, regardless of whether we are regional, local, or national funders. I think the first most important point is to, again, don't start from scratch. Build off previous efforts and existing resources like the ones that we just shared a moment ago. Several early implementing states have already done some very heavy lifting, as I said, and Louisiana being a great example of that. And while, of course, each state and district faces its own context and may limit the applicability of results from all cases to each case, there's almost always some overlap that make other experiences relevant. So these sophisticated curriculum review processes like those done in Louisiana, the ones that have been done in Tennessee, New York City, are underway in Washington. You know, this is this is stuff that we should all be able to learn with. So connect with local funders in those places that have supported those efforts, and just, again, don't start from nothing. So if your state or your district is undergoing curriculum review or is in the midst of a procurement process, like Amy mentioned, it's so important to ensure that highly trained educators are involved. And as Bill noted just a moment ago, this is an absolutely indispensable professional development opportunity as well. So if your focus is on teacher professional development, this is one of just the most powerful ways that educators can dig deeply into the standards and what they mean for instruction. Moreover, of course, educator participation in reviewing curriculum ensures that the results are workable in classrooms, ground truth things, and generates broader buy-in to the effort. This is absolutely critical, and funders can help ensure that this happens. So we want to, of course, expand that professional learning for educators by empowering educators to supplement and adapt curricula on their own. This is not easy. We've noted today, of course, some of the best curriculum options out there are, in fact, open educational resources available online, free of charge. It doesn't mean that they're just free. It means that many of them carry open educational resource licenses like Creative Commons licensing that permit the adaptation and resharing of lessons and units. So funders can invest in training local educators about how to adapt existing materials well, and then, of course, please to reshare them to increase the volume of the great stuff that's out there. And remember that every solid curriculum purchasing decision, most of which are made locally, send powerful messages to traditional publishers about what the field is beginning to expect when it comes to Common Core alignment and implementation. So, the expansion of OER materials and the emergence of some of these upstart new curriculum developers, they're really exciting developments and create openings in the field that we didn't think was possible prior to the widespread adoption of the Common Core. But they can only exert so much pressure on a $8 to $9 billion textbook industry. So the more local districts demand of traditional publishers, the faster we can expect the meaningful overhauls that Bill described as are so necessary to support educators in bringing the standards to life in classrooms. And it's not just our role as funders to give money away, right, but it's also to be a knowledge resource for state and district curriculum purchasers. Again, almost every decision is made locally, so I know this might sound crazy, but get to know your state's procurement laws. In many states, like Louisiana, states can make recommendations to districts about what they might consider purchasing, but in most cases, that's up to local districts and school boards. So it's really important to educate these decision makers about how important their purchasing decisions are, and to really ask tough questions of folks that are offering their services. And of course, to let them know about tools like the IMET and the EQUIP rubrics that can help inform good choices and that can serve as the basis for a really rigorous curriculum review process. So with that, I'm going to close things out and hand it back to our moderators.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Just wanted to let everyone know that you will be able to find webinar materials at www.edfunders.org/common-core. There you can find a lot of resources that GFE has uploaded related to the Common Core, but you will find the slide deck from today as well as some of the articles that Amy referred to that talk about Louisiana, that talk about some of Bill Schmidt's work, as well as some of the research that will be there. So I wanted to thank our presenters for participating in today's webinar and sharing the information with us. For all of the funders that are also on the call and your good questions, and thank you for participating today. Look for more resources that you'll see on GFE coming up. Thank you very much.